92 days. That's the countdown from today to July 1st, 2026, the date the Free Trade Commission must convene and answer one question: does CUSMA survive? The answer determines whether $733 billion in bilateral trade stays tariff-free or enters a decade of uncertainty, whether auto parts keep crossing the border 7 to 8 times before assembly, or the supply chain fractures permanently, whether 34 U.S. states keep their largest export market, or watch it diversify away in real time. Most people think the negotiation starts in July. They're wrong. It started months ago. And Mark Carney has been playing his moves while Washington was fighting a war in Iran, losing court cases, and posting on Truth Social. By the time Trump's trade team sits down at the review table, they're going to discover something that should concentrate every mind in the White House. The game is already half over, and they haven't made a single strategic move. If you've been following this channel, hit like right now and subscribe, because I'm about to show you every move Carney has made in the last 92 days, how each one was a deliberate tile in a mosaic that only becomes visible when you see it complete, and why sources inside Ottawa's trade ministry describe the CUSMA review not as a negotiation Canada needs to win, but as a position Canada has already won. The review in July is the formality. The outcome is already being decided. Before we trace Carney's moves, you need to understand what's structurally at stake. Because CUSMA's mandatory review isn't a negotiation where you haggle over line items. It's a fork in the road with 3 paths, and each country picks independently. Door 1, extend. All 3 countries confirm support for extending CUSMA to 2042. Business as usual, stability. The next review in 2032. Door 2, withdraw. Any country can leave with 6 months written notice. If the U.S. withdraws, CUSMA continues between Canada and Mexico. The U.S. is the one on the outside. Door 3, limbo. 1 or more countries signal non-renewal without withdrawing. This triggers annual reviews every year until CUSMA's scheduled expiry in 2036. A decade of uncertainty, in which every year is another referendum on whether the agreement survives. Trump has called CUSMA irrelevant and said it may have served its purpose. His trade representative Jameson Greer has listed grievances: dairy, wine and spirits, digital services, content regulations. The signals point toward Door 3 or a heavily conditional Door 1. Extend only if Canada makes major concessions. Carney's strategy is built for all 3 doors, and that's what makes it devastating. He's not preparing for one scenario. He's positioned to win regardless of which door Trump tries to open. March 5th, 2026. From Australia, during a media availability, Carney said 6 words that reframed the entire review before it officially began. CUSMA effectively has been broken in the short term by U.S. actions. This was not a slip, not frustration, not a headline-chasing comment from a man who doesn't do imprecision. It was a calculated opening move that accomplished 3 things simultaneously. First, it shifted the burden. In any negotiation, the party asking for changes is at a disadvantage. By declaring CUSMA broken by American actions, i.e. EPA tariffs ruled illegal, Section 232 tariffs on allies, trade talks canceled over a television advertisement, annexation threats against a treaty partner, Carney positioned the U.S. as the party that broke the agreement. Canada isn't asking for concessions. Canada is demanding repair. That is a fundamentally different negotiating posture, and it arrived at the table before the table was even set. If CUSMA is already broken, the review isn't about preserving the status quo. It's about building something new, something that prevents the pattern of abuse from recurring. This gives Carney the political space to demand structural changes, binding dispute resolution, limitations on unilateral tariff actions, energy sovereignty protections that would have been considered overreach if CUSMA were functioning normally. Third, it signaled Mexico, By saying it publicly before his trade minister's meeting with the U.S. Trade Representative, Carney sent a message to Mexico City. Canada considers the current framework inadequate. If Mexico shares that view, and it does, the two countries can coordinate. If the U.S. tries to negotiate bilaterally and sideline Canada, it will find that Canada and Mexico are already aligned. 6 words, 3 simultaneous moves. The opening gambit of a grandmaster's game. The day after Carney's declaration, Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc sat down with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer in Washington. Also present, Canada's newly appointed Ambassador Mark Wiseman and Chief CUSMA negotiator Janice Charette. The public readout was diplomatic, constructive, and substantive discussion. Agreement to continue talking in the coming days. But notice what was happening in parallel. One day before the LeBlanc-Greer meeting, Greer's office announced that the U.S. was officially launching CUSMA review negotiations with Mexico, bilateral scoping discussions starting March 16th. Canada was not included. This is the move that echoes the original CUSMA negotiations. During Trump's first term, the U.S. negotiated with Mexico first and presented Canada with a fait accompli. Robert Lighthizer wrote in his book that Washington and Mexico City were prepared to move forward bilaterally if Canada didn't cooperate. The implication was clear. The U.S. can isolate Canada within its own trade agreement. Carney anticipated this. In February, LeBlanc led a large trade mission to Mexico. His Mexican counterparts confirmed they wanted to maintain the trilateral structure. Mexico's Economy Secretary, Marcelo Ebrard, signaled that Mexico's positions on rules of origin, supply chain security, and production, issues where Mexico and Canada share interests against American pressure, were largely aligned with Canada's. When Greer sits across from Ebrard, he will find that Mexico's positions track closely with Canada's. That is not coincidence. That is preparation. Carney neutralized the bilateral isolation play before it was played. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what Carney did next, building the evidence wall that makes his negotiating position structurally unassailable, is the move that changes everything. While the diplomatic positioning was happening, Carney was constructing the evidence wall, the proof that Canada has alternatives. The demonstration that CUSMA, while valuable, is no longer existential for Canada. And that changes the mathematics of every threat Washington can make. January 16th, China Strategic Partnership signed in Beijing. Canola tariffs slashed from 85% to 15%. $4 billion agricultural market reopened. 49,000 Chinese EVs admitted. Message to Washington, we have other buyers. March 5th, EU CETA enhancements signed in Toronto. Digital trade chapter added. Professional mobility frameworks for multiple sectors. Access to Europe's construction market. Message, and they're growing. Same week, Canada-India free trade talks announced. Goal to conclude by year-end. Canada-Norway strategic partnership operational. Canada-Denmark Defence Pact signed. UK Economic and Trade Working Group producing binding agreements. Canada's non-U.S. export share at a 40-year low in U.S. dependency. Non-U.S. trade up $69 billion in 2025. CPTPP trade up 42.9%. EU trade up 59.8%. Canada exceeded its own diversification target, hitting $296 billion in non-U.S. exports, when the goal was $292 billion. Why does this matter for the CUSMA review? Because every trade deal signed before July changes the mathematics of the negotiation. The threat of CUSMA termination loses leverage against a country that demonstrably has alternative buyers, and gains leverage against the United States, whose 34 largest export destination states cannot redirect their trade as quickly as Canada already has. Carney walks into the review room carrying signed agreements with China, the EU, the UK, Norway, Japan, India, and 12 CPTPP nations. Trump walks in carrying a struck-down tariff regime and expiring replacements. The evidence wall speaks for itself. The legal prepositioning is the fourth move, and it may be the most structurally consequential. February 20th, 2026. The Supreme Court strikes down IEEPA tariffs. Chief Justice Roberts, those words cannot bear such weight. Every IEEPA tariff on Canada declared illegal. $175 billion in refund liability mounting. Carney's legal team is reportedly preparing to use that precedent as a structural demand in the review itself. The position, any renewed CUSMA must include binding provisions preventing a future president from imposing unilateral tariffs on CUSMA partners using emergency powers. The Supreme Court ruling establishes the principle: emergency powers don't include tariff authority. The CUSMA review should codify that principle inside the agreement. This move is elegant because it converts Trump's own loss into Canada's gain. The court said IEEPA can't be used for tariffs. Canada says put it in the treaty. If the U.S. refuses, after its own Supreme Court just ruled that exact practice illegal, the refusal is legally and diplomatically indefensible. Canada's WTO challenges against Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum are simultaneously building toward rulings. Each favorable finding becomes another piece of evidence that U.S. tariff policy violates international obligations. By July, Canada may arrive at the review table with both the Supreme Court ruling and WTO panel findings confirming that the U.S. systematically violated its trade commitments. The legal position Carney is constructing isn't just about winning the CUSMA review. It's about ensuring that whatever emerges from the review is structurally protected against the pattern of tariff abuse that defined the last 18 months. He's not negotiating a trade deal. He's building a legal fortress around it. The fifth move is the one hiding in plain sight, because it was made 6 years ago and only activated now. CUSMA's elimination of the energy proportionality clause means Canada has no treaty obligation to maintain America's historical share of energy exports. Under old NAFTA, if Canada built Pacific LNG terminals and redirected oil westward, it was legally required to maintain America's proportional share. Under Trump's CUSMA, the deal he called his greatest achievement, that requirement is gone. Carney doesn't need to threaten to use this leverage in the review. He just needs to demonstrate that the infrastructure to exercise it is being built. LNG terminals on the Pacific coast, China and Japan supply contracts, the Trans Mountain Pipeline tripling capacity, pipeline construction backed by Asian sovereign wealth. Each project is a visible reminder: if the review goes badly, the energy flows that American refineries depend on have somewhere else to go. And with Hormuz still disrupted and oil above $100, the value of Canadian energy to American refineries has never been higher. At the exact moment, Canada's alternatives have never been more real. Carney won't say, "Give us a good deal or we redirect your oil." The terminals say it. The contracts say it. The construction permits say it. Every refinery operator in the Midwest is already running the numbers. And the energy card, placed on the table without being played, is the most powerful card in the room. Now let me connect this to your daily life. Because the CUSMA countdown isn't abstract policy. It lands in your wallet, your job, and the price of everything you buy that crosses a border. If you're in Michigan, Ohio, or Indiana, every day of CUSMA uncertainty is a day your plants can't plan, your suppliers can't sign contracts, and your workers don't know if their next shift is guaranteed. GM has already disclosed $3 to $4 billion in tariff costs for 2026. Uncertainty on top of tariff costs creates the kind of investment pause that becomes permanent restructuring. If you're in a border state, 34 states count Canada as their top export market. If the review produces limbo, every Canadian buyer of American goods faces the same uncertainty, and uncertainty for buyers produces the same result as tariffs for sellers. Orders slow, relationships reroute. Canada's 18 months of diversification becomes the preferred path, not the contingency. If you own Canadian-linked stocks or have retirement savings exposed to energy and autos, The Cosmo clock is already in the market. Every headline, every escalation, every signal from either capital moves prices in trade-sensitive sectors. The uncertainty itself is the tax, and it compounds daily until the review produces clarity. The 92-day countdown is not a diplomatic abstraction. It is a timer attached to the economic security of every household on both sides of the border. And right now, only one government is treating it that way. Let me lay out the position as it stands with 92 days remaining. Carney has declared Cosmo broken, shifting the burden to Washington, dispatched his trade team to establish direct dialogue, coordinated with Mexico to prevent bilateral isolation, built a diversification portfolio exceeding $296 billion in non-U.S. exports, secured a Supreme Court ruling invalidating the U.S.'s primary tariff weapon, filed WTO challenges building toward favorable rulings, activated the proportionality gap with Pacific energy infrastructure, signed defense pacts across the Arctic and Anglosphere, and assembled a coalition of allies who will be watching the review outcome and drawing their own conclusions. Trump has called Cosmo irrelevant, lost IEEPA, watched Section 122 tick toward its July 24th expiry, launched Section 301 investigations that won't produce usable results before the review, started a war consuming $1 to $2 billion per day that has alienated every ally he might otherwise lean on, insulted the leader he'll be negotiating with for 18 consecutive months, and sent his trade team to begin bilateral talks with Mexico, a move designed to isolate Canada that has, in practice, pushed Canada and Mexico closer together. 92 days. Every one of them matters. Every trade deal signed, every legal ruling issued, every allied agreement inked between now and July is another tile in the mosaic. When the Free Trade Commission convenes, the question won't be whether Cosmo survives. Some version of it will, because termination is mutually destructive, and no rational actor chooses it unilaterally when 34 stakes depend on the relationship. The question is what Cosmo becomes, whether it's renewed on terms that protect Canadian sovereignty and constrain future tariff abuse, or whether it's renewed on American terms that try to restore the structural advantages Trump accidentally gave away. Carney has 92 days. Based on what he's done with the last 92, that should be more than enough. So, here's the question I want you to answer in the comments, because I read every single one, and this one genuinely doesn't have an obvious answer. If you were advising Trump's trade team right now, what would you tell them to do in the next 92 days to counter what Carney has already built? Because from where I'm sitting, every card has been preempted. Every isolation play has been anticipated. Every legal threat has been turned into legal leverage. What's left? Subscribe. Turn on notifications. The countdown is live. The mosaic is almost complete. And July is coming, whether Washington is ready or not.